Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. Got a fun one for you all this time because Natalia Emmons, our wonderful producer, had a bit of an idea, something that we haven't done before. She wants me to react to another writer slash editor's content, specifically a video. And we thought about this a little bit, and I haven't seen the video yet, but I think this could work. If it doesn't work, then I would probably never release it. But the fact that you're listening to this now means that apparently it worked enough. All I know is that the name of this video, it's the worst writing advice on the internet. And I will say the main reason I wanted to do this is because this is coming from a YouTuber who I am a fan of. I've watched many of her videos. I was a subscriber of hers. This is Alyssas, by the way. I was a subscriber of hers a long time ago, back when, I think she had just started her channel. It was like 2023, 2022, something like that. And she had, a couple thousand subscribers, something like that. And she's come a long way since then. She's at 74.8 thousand subscribers, I'm seeing here, which is super cool to see. And I will say I'm using the Fantasy Writing for Barbarians kind of YouTube thing. You'll see it in a second if you're watching the video. And I've never actually used it before, but yeah, I just want to make sure my algorithm is not on display for everybody because that could be a bit of a pain point. But anyway, we're going to do that today. And in case you don't know who I am John Negroni. I'm a fantasy author, professional writer, and editor for over 10 years. And I thought this would be interesting too, because Natalia let me know that this is a bad writing advice video thing. And I was like, okay, it's Alyssa Background. And she is very specifically not somebody who does a lot of fantasy, either as an editor or writer. So I thought, oh, okay, that could actually be something maybe useful to those of you who listen to this show, because I can maybe watch this video and react as a fantasy author and editor and maybe give that extra sort of, I guess, flavor to what she's saying. I have watched a lot of her stuff and still gotten plenty out of it, even though it's not really specific to fantasy, because a lot of the advice that she gives, it can be pretty accessible and universal to that end. So my hope, depending on I guess how this video goes is that if you haven't seen any of her content yet, you can start checking out and subscribe to her. She has really great stuff, specifically if you're trying to query agents. She does a lot of content around that. That's pretty useful and helpful for folks. And she always gives advice from an editor's perspective first and foremost, which is a little different from me. I usually give my advice, definitely some editor stuff, but a lot of it from the author perspective. So yeah, that's kind of what you're going to get, especially if you're not just a fantasy writer and you also maybe like to do romance novels or maybe horror or other things along those lines. She covers, I think, more genres holistically than I do, that's for sure. But okay, that's enough of that. Let's get into it. And I'll have my big old headphones on, so that should be fun. And for sure, if you are listening to this podcast only, don't worry, we have some audio playing. So even though you won't be able to see her in the graphics and stuff, I'll do my best to try to explain the context and all of that so you can enjoy it as well. So here we go. All right, my big headphones are on. I always feel I look like so goofy when I wear these things, but oh well. We're writers. We're not here to look amazing, but I'll do my best. All right, so there is the video there. It's called The Worst Writing Advice on the Internet. Bit hyperbolic, but I don't mind myself. I like a little bit of hyperbole when we can. So that's Liz Matistic there. Also, shout out to somebody who, I don't know if she's still a Bay Area writer, editor person, but I think she was or used to be. So shout out to somebody else in the Bay Area world. There's not that many of us, but we're doing what we can. All right, so here we go.
Show don't tell. Write every day. Write likable characters. I'm sick of seeing bad writing advice like this go viral online. And
So that's interesting. Wait, so we got a little bit of a precursor, I guess. I think these are going to be some of the things we're going to talk about. I'll, of course, wait to weigh in on that. But I will say, as somebody who, talks about this stuff pretty regularly, I don't pay too much attention to stuff that goes viral necessarily, but we'll get into that. I think for me, a lot of the stuff I come across is more in the YouTube space. I'm not really I'm on Blue Sky a little bit, but a lot of this stuff kind of breezes past me personally.
while most of it sounds good in theory, it's often taken out of context, misunderstood, or taken too far,
Very
which
true.
can actually make your writing worse. I know what you might be thinking. Wait, don't you give writing advice on this channel all the time? I do. And I'm not saying I have all the answers, but I have worked at the biggest publishing house in the United States and have helped hundreds of authors strengthen their stories and get published. So
Yeah,
here's my
so a little context for Alyssa here too. Yeah, she used to work for one of the big publishing houses, and she kind of is alluding to there. She does like editorial services. So if you are writing outside of fantasy, like if you're writing literary or again like romance, horror, stuff like that, I think she provides help, like consultations and things like that for folks. If you're interested, again, you can see her channel here, but it's Alyssa Matesic. And if you're listening, I'll in the show notes, I'll put like a link if you want to check out her stuff.
take on the 7 worst pieces of writing advice you'll find online and what I think you should do instead,
7.
including a controversial topic I'll get to at the end. Let's start with the most overused writing advice you've definitely heard before: show, don't tell. This isn't just
Yeah, I had a feeling she would start with show don't tell. Yeah, and in Show Don't Tell, I've talked about it on this show that it's widely misunderstood. I think a lot of people throw this advice out a little carelessly. I'm curious what she's going to say about it. I'm going to let her do her piece, and then I'll, of course, give the fantasy perspective on it.
the most common writing advice, it's also the most misunderstood. Don't get me wrong, showing does help you craft vivid, immersive scenes and place your reader in your story. Instead of telling us Sarah was nervous, it's more effective to show her biting her nails, tapping her foot, or anxiously looking at the door every 5 seconds. From those gestures, the reader will be able to deduce that she's nervous. Showing is about not spoon feeding things to the reader, letting them experience the scene and inhabit the character's mind and body. This is
So, yeah, and in fantasy, this tends to be pretty important because fantasy has we get a little bit more grace in terms of word count. We have a lot more room on the page that it's expected we are going to tell certain things. But the trap that a lot of fantasy authors run into, and I see this all the time, is that they are not showing enough. And they are sort of getting into this habit where because they have to do a lot of telling in terms of like lore and exposition, they're doing the same thing with character emotion, right? And in fantasy, that's not good. In fantasy, it starts to feel like a textbook. So I think she has more to say here, though, before I'm going to get my full fantasy.
all good. But here's where this writing advice often goes wrong. It doesn't mean you should never tell the reader things. Some writers, having heard the advice show don't tell over and over and over again, are terrified that if they tell the reader anything, their story will come off as amateurish. I see
Yeah, and I think in fantasy, I've seen this float around too, where people think that you have to show exposition sometimes in terms of like the world building. So, for example, instead of being like the magic system works this way, like someone explaining it to someone, you have to do it through showing how the magic system works. But the thing is, if you show how the magic system works, you still need some telling embedded in that. It's not like you can just have a character do a bunch of stuff and then the other character observing it doesn't have any context for what's happening. There still has to be some explanation. And yeah, it just takes a little bit of writer's craft to do that effectively. Whereas, like, sometimes people will be like, oh, this is too much tell and not enough show. And sometimes that advice can be a little bit too vague. It can be a little bit too, like, well, what do you mean? Like, what's a specific part in this passage where you felt like maybe I needed to show something instead of tell it? That would be my response to anybody who's, kind of throwing that advice out and they're not sure how to take it.
it all the time in manuscripts I'm editing. Authors will focus so much on showing that the entire scene simply describes what's going on externally in a scene on the surface. But they fail
I've seen this a lot. Even in fantasy, I've seen 4 or 5 paragraphs where it's just legitimately like a whole big chunk of text that is just trying to communicate, like she's saying, that a character is nervous or that they're panicked or that they're angry, like a singular emotion or maybe a combination of like simple emotions. And it's like she paced around, she threw the chair at the wall, she jumped up and down. Sometimes it's just like too much and it undercuts the impact of the emotion that you're actually trying to communicate. And I've also seen it where you do a lot of showing for just the emotion, but you aren't. And then when it comes to like the telling, it's off balance where it's like 4 paragraphs of show, 4 paragraphs of tell. Where really this stuff should be quilted. You should have show and tell in every single paragraph. Some showing, some telling. Sometimes, yeah, it's going to be mostly telling or it's going to be mostly showing. But that balance, that pace, that flow is really, really important, especially in fantasy. Because in fantasy, we do have to tell a lot more. We have to explain a lot of things that you don't necessarily have to explain a lot in literary stuff. And in terms of, withholding information and creating subtext and getting people involved in your world building and your lore and all of that. So for us, it's even harder sometimes because we have to balance the two things really effectively in ways that can be very daunting and can inflate your word count, can get to a point where you're like, I have like 5,000 words on the page. I don't know what to do.
Fail to reveal what's going on a layer beneath the surface in the character's mind. The result is a flat, static scene that doesn't land emotionally. Sometimes you should tell us what a character is thinking or feeling, so we understand how they're responding and reacting to the events of the story. In fact, without those moments of interiority, the story will feel one dimensional. The real skill is knowing when to show and when to tell. Both are critical to effective storytelling. So the advice really shouldn't be show, don't tell, but rather show
Yeah.
and tell.
Show and
I have
tell.
another video that does a deeper dive into how to show and tell effectively with examples, so I will link that in the description. This
So I agree with a lot of that. And I think that, what she's saying there too, in terms of like being able to show and tell, but also making sure you don't lose some of that emotional impact because sometimes you do tell. I think the underlying message here is that you just don't want to overload the reader with too much information in general. Sometimes it's even showing can be as wordy, garrulous, and confusing as telling, right? Because again, you're just trying to communicate one thing, but it's taking you 7 sentences to do it. That's kind of grating on the reader. I think the idea is to be more efficient, and balancing between showing and telling is the most efficient way generally of getting your points across and getting the reader kind of immersed in all of that. And that, you know, I think that, for example, what she's saying there about like it's too much description. I've run into this problem where in fantasy, I really want characters to feel like they're inside of an environment. So I'm going to have, a lot of description. I'm going to have the character kind of, the POV character sort of pontificating on what kind of environment they're in. What does it smell like? What does it look like? One little trick, one little hack that I like to do is I like to express what a place is like by observing the character actions within that place. So it's not just I'm at these like dock works at sunrise. It's like I see sailors are like crawling out of the bars. It looks like they didn't even sleep last night. And it's this imagery that immediately your mind, your imagination starts to spin of like, oh, I can kind of see these like drunk sailors coming out, weary that they have to do another day of work. And what does this tell me? It tells me that this is a scene where these characters are in a bad mood, that it's kind of dim, it's kind of dark out, there's a tone there. And I've done all of this just through simple character action and observation. And in that case, that is showing and telling because I'm showing through the action, but I am telling you like, clearly this happened, right? That these characters making a guess of like what these sailors were up to last night. And so that's a good example of how you can do this stuff without, I didn't have to do 3 paragraphs. It was like a sentence or two and then immediately putting like an image in your mind. Now for me, sometimes I overdo it. I do that, but then I'll do like 3 other things, just to give you even more stuff. But that's just because, I love to do stuff like that. But I would say that, in terms of fantasy too, a lot of the time you can't get around telling. And I think even the classics are going to fall into this sort of thing where, for example, Lord of the Rings, like Tolkien, he tells us about the fall of Numenor, for example, before we ever get to like Gondor. Like he does these little things where he just like explains things very early, but he uses it as like foreshadowing, and you kind of need that in something like the Lord of the Rings, because if you had to show everything that happens in those novels, they'd be like 20 novels long and counting. It would be way too much. So like expositions, and it's not a crime. I think that even in something like in an anime, like Attack on Titan, a lot of like the political stuff, a lot of the mythos, a lot is just sort of like narrated. It's just, here's what it is. Like here's what happens in this world. These are the stakes. This is the situation. Because it's so quickly stated, yeah, it's a little bit of like a show don't tell crime, but what do you get in return for that? If you're getting something good in return, that's great. That means in Attack on Titan, you get to the action a little bit faster. You are able to sort of dispense with the politics and just sort of get to the heart of the matter. And then the character stuff that happens is a little bit more organic, is a little bit more visceral. So I'd say that that's how you can basically discern these things. You have to know when to show, when to tell, and all of that, right? You can't erase one entirely. And if anybody comes back to your writing and is like, get rid of the telling and, focus more on showing, I would be very, very skeptical about that advice, right? I'd be a little bit more, I guess, if somebody gives you any advice when it comes to show don't tell, maybe pay attention to if they're saying, "Hey, here's a moment where you can maybe show this one specific thing a little bit better," or there's a little bit of an off balance here. I'm getting a little bit too much of one thing, but I'd like to get a little bit more of the other thing. That's how you can maybe pick apart like a beta reader or critique partner, whoever is trying to give you some advice on your manuscript or whatever it is.
Next piece of bad writing advice really gets on my nerves, which is saying something because I was an English major. Only read from the canon. I see some
Oh,
version of this in my YouTube comments all the time. People
so I think in her context, she's talking about classic literature. In our context, we'll probably be talking about, the classic fantasy. So I already mentioned Lord of the Rings, but also pulp novels, Pilgrim's Progress, things like that, John Carter. This isn't something that we typically deal with in fantasy. I think it's widely understood that, you know, you should be reading a lot of different things. I've never seen a lot of contentious stuff in that regard, but I do want to keep
People
going on
will
this.
opine that you should only read the classics like Austen, Dickens, or Tolstoy for examples of how to write well. They claim that books written by contemporary authors are formulaic, all sound the same, and are terrible compared to the literary greats of yesteryear.
Yeah, I get this in fantasy sometimes actually. Like I hear, oh yeah, a lot of the fantasy stuff that comes out is very book talk. It's driven by viral marketing campaigns. It's not really driven by organic craft and books that are actually really good. You see this a lot more, I think, on Reddit more than anywhere else. And I will say, sure, there's plenty of schlock, but there's a difference between that and it maybe being a little pretentious and saying like, oh, well, only Wheel of Time is viable fantasy, or even something that isn't super old, that's semi recent, like The Name of the Wind, anything by Patrick Rothfuss, right? A lot of folks will look at his work and say, well, that's an example of like something that evokes classic fantasy and that's why it works. Where I think that the number one thing you should do is you should build a range. You should know the classics and you should know what's contemporary because why wouldn't you want to? Wouldn't you want to have a far more reaching kind of, don't you want to be prepared for any scenario? Don't you want to quiver with lots of different arrows for any kind of situation? Classic fantasy is going to help you write great fantasy that is timeless, but then contemporary stuff is going to help you connect with a generation that you might not belong to or that you want to understand better, even if it's one you're inside of, right? So yeah, I'd say that anything's fair game. Yeah, any time period. Yeah, don't limit yourself to just the classics. Why would you?
Like I said, I was an English major, so I definitely love some of the classics, but I couldn't disagree with this advice more. Reading the canon can absolutely help you understand story architecture, effective character development, and how to portray universal timeless themes. But so can reading modern literature.
And on the classics too, I think that classics can also really help you understand where we've been. You can maybe come up with really cool story ideas by reading classic literature, and not just fantasy stuff, but also literary stuff too. Like if you want to read Pride and Prejudice, and you're like, this could use zombies. That's where we get Pride and Prejudice and zombies, right? Like I was just rewatching 2005 Pride and Prejudice. And I was so fascinated by how well that movie, which is 20 years old now, how well it holds up, even though it's so old fashioned, right? And there's so much to it that I guess at first glance, like I wouldn't be that into it. I would probably just watch it and appreciate it as a film and little else. But the emotional reaction that I still had to that film is kind of amazing. It's kind of interesting and it can shed a little bit of light. It can give you a little bit of inspiration. I'm like, I wonder how I can use that in my writing today. Like, what is that timeless thing that they were able to do with these classic novels like that, anything by Emily Dickinson, anything by Louisa May Alcott, like these stories that just like last through the test of time. Like what is it about them intrinsically that is just like lasting for people, that still connects with people? What are those fundamental core human truths? And you can apply that to contemporary stuff too.
There are so many authors writing today that deserve your attention. Here are some of my favorites. If you're convinced
And I would agree that it's nothing beats like when you actually get to discover a new writer, or like something new comes out and you feel like you get to be part of that moment when it comes out and you're like, wow, this is a book that might become a classic someday. Now of course we don't want to be presumptuous and assume that that's always going to be the case, but yeah, no, I think that that's really cool when it does work out that way. I would certainly say like there have been plenty of novels I've read where I felt like, okay, maybe it's not going to be a classic, but it's going to be a classic for me. and yeah, I would say like an example of that is when I first read Babel, I just felt like, wow, this novel, this is the kind of fantasy novel that if I was teaching a class at a university, I would love, about fantasy writing, I would love for students to read this and get a lot out of it. And I don't really care that a lot of people say negative things about Babel on the internet. What are you going to do? And so Alyssa did like pump up a bunch of books on the screen. I'll make
That
sure I
there's
see
no
it.
author writing today whose work would interest you,
Let's
I
see.
promise you just haven't read enough yet. I think this advice is especially harmful if you're planning to publish your book. Because if you
Oh, I think I
all
went
day, that
past it.
means character development and how to portray universal timeless themes. But so can some of the classics modern literature. There are so many authors writing today that deserve your attention. Here are some of my favorites.
There we go. And yeah, so she puts down two of these novels I really like. The Handmaid's Tale, classic Margaret Atwood book, written in the '80s. So, but I've never seen read The Remains of the Day, but I've heard great things. American Marriage I haven't read, but Normal People, one of my favorite novels from romance novels last 15 years at least. And that novel came out like 2017, 18, something like that. Love that novel. Sally Rooney in general is just such a great she's such a great author at capturing like the feeling of people today that is so specific to I think millennials in particular. But I even when that book came out, it was like kind of the later millennials, so the ones who are like closer to Gen Z. But yeah, as a millennial myself, I still connect with it pretty deeply. And I have Intermezzo, Sally Rooney's newest thing, like right here on my desk. I'll show you. Sometimes people don't believe me when I say this stuff. Right here. Intermezzo. I got this one when I was in Iceland, and I picked it up because the price was good, and which is saying something. So in Iceland, the price is never good. But anyway,
If you're convinced that there's no author writing today whose work would interest you, I promise you just haven't read enough yet. I think this advice is especially harmful if you're planning to publish your book. Because if you only read classic novels, you're not going to have a robust understanding of the genre conventions, literary styles, and themes that are resonating with readers today. After
and I'd say it's possible that you still can. Like it's not like there are novels that come out that do still feel like they are totally just trying to evoke the classics, but they're few and far between. And it's a lot harder. The pressure is much higher in those cases because you're competing with classic literature, which is you don't want to have to do that. That's a tough battle to put yourself in.
all, most readers going to the bookstore aren't picking up Wuthering Heights for their next beach vacation. So instead of limiting yourself to classics, I recommend reading widely from both canonical and contemporary authors. There is so much to learn about effective storytelling from across generations. The next piece of bad writing advice is everywhere, but is one of the fastest ways to burn out. Write every day. Let me be clear.
And before we get to that one, I guess the only other thing I would say is that something that contemporary novels do in the fantasy world as well. So books like Black Sun and even modern anime like Made in Abyss. Some of the things that these stories are able to do is they're able to innovate on form and theme in exciting ways, in ways that connect with audiences that really just kind of feel exciting because they're easier to market. They're easier to sort of be like, hey, this is a story that it has a premise or a hook that hasn't really been done before. And if the novel lives up to that hook, that marketing, then you're in a really great position to sell some awesome books, right? And so, yeah, I'd say that even goes for like the Locked Tomb series. I mean, the way Gideon the Ninth, which yeah, it's not my favorite series in terms of the story, but I recognize it's very successful for a reason. And I think one of the reasons is because I love the writing style. I love the way it's so close to the characters and the way it presents its world is so, again, exciting. It's innovative. It feels visceral, feels different and new. And that newness is something that you want to have, at least in some kind of capacity. You want your book to feel like indispensable for the main reason of like no one's really quite done it like this before because it's you doing it. And if you are only reading the classics, it can be kind of hard to break out of that, to kind of push yourself into something totally new. If you don't have that range, if you don't have that understanding of like, here's where we've been, here's where we're at right now, here's what I can do next. That really kind of just upgrades fantasy. And fantasy in particular, it's hard to do that because so many things have been done in fantasy already. So many ideas have been done. And so it can be a little bit daunting. But on the other hand, fantasy also allows for so much imagination that really there's no limits, right? The limit is really on your imagination. And the more you read, the more you expand your imagination. So, yeah, locking yourself into just kind of one category is going to, again, that's going to lock you into like one thing. And it's going to make it a lot harder for you to be original, different, exciting, and new.
Clear. Writing consistently is important. In fact, most of the best selling authors I work with do have some kind of writing routine or habit in place.
Yeah, there's a big difference between, because again, the bad writing advice here is write every day. There's a big difference between having a writing routine and forcing yourself to write every day. And I'll say off the offset, I don't write every single day. I never really have. It's just not something that works for me. I know some people who do that, but yeah, no, I don't feel like writing every day, and I don't need to. I think that's a different thing from having a habit, from having a routine. And I've said it on this podcast before. If I'm working on a new project, my goal is to work on that project every day. And that doesn't just include writing, though. That includes things like editing. It includes things like researching, maybe getting into a TV show that kind of inspires things, writing notes every day, doing a little bit of something for this project every day. In other words, thinking about this project every single day. That to me is much more of an effective, manageable thing to do than just sitting down and being like, I'm going to write 3,000 words today. Because here's what happens: you do that, you get burnt out because those 3,000 words are probably going to be worthless because you are just doing it. You're forcing yourself to do it. And I know a lot of people who say it's like, well, it's good because you just get better and better as you go. But I've said this many times: in fantasy, what happens is that you get really excited by a new world that you're creating, and then you're just writing and writing and writing, and then you lose touch with that world. It stops being exciting. It starts becoming too familiar. And all of a sudden you start to feel like, "Oh, this project isn't really good. It it's surface level. It doesn't have a lot of substance." And this happens so often with fantasy. But if you're working on it every single day, you are outlining, a little bit every week. You are doing specific things that build and enrich your world every day. Then that feeling, that urge to write is going to come naturally. You're going to want to be writing. That's the kind of feeling that you want to go for. Because if you have an idea of like, all right, I've been working on this a lot. I understand the kind of novel that I want to create here. Writing feels less like a chore. It feels less like you're doing all the work at the typing stage. The typing stage, you just want to translate all the work that you've already done, right? It's like stretching before a marathon, practicing in 2 mile sprints, and then bringing yourself to that triumphant moment where you feel like, all right, I've done a lot of the legwork already. Now I just have to put it into practice.
But here's the key: it has to be sustainable for you, and every schedule looks different. Writing every single day simply isn't realistic or feasible for everyone.
That's true
And it
too.
doesn't serve everyone's creative process. For writers who are managing other responsibilities or who have personal circumstances that don't allow them to write every day, not being able to adhere to this schedule can lead to guilt and shame. That's the opposite of productive and could lead you to give up your writing practice altogether, the last thing we want. So if
That's why I tell people it's like you will lose momentum eventually. If you're in this thing where you're writing a couple thousand words a day or 500 words a day, whatever it is, you are going to miss a day or two. And as soon as you miss a day, it starts to get easier and easier to miss more days, and then you lose it. But if you're working on it every single day and trying to write consistently, of like, oh yeah, this week I want to have this chapter done. What is it going to take to have this chapter done? Well, I need to plan this. I need to outline this. I need to research this. I need to write a bunch of sample scenes and do all this sort of stuff. And these are little bite sized things that you can do every day, that you can work on or work toward every day, versus being like, I'm just going to power through a manuscript in however long. Again, it does, like she said, it doesn't suit everybody's creative process. Not everybody is able to write effectively that way. Some people are. And if you're that person, awesome. I'm not trying to tell you that you're doing anything wrong. If this works for you, fantastic. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to her. But I think a lot more of you are probably listening and be like, oh, thank goodness. Like, I hate that pressure of like, I have to produce, I have to be creative every day. I have this spotlight on me. I'm being forced in this situation where I have this deadline. And it's like, it's making this whole thing, first of all, a lot less fun, but then also it stops feeling imaginative. It stops feeling creative. It starts feeling like pencil pushing, which you don't want.
writing every day just doesn't work for you, build a system that does. And don't feel guilty about it. Maybe you write for 1 hour, 3 days a week. Maybe you carve out time on the weekends only. I even have one client who binge writes in 6 hour bursts once a week.
I've done that before. That can be fun if it works for you. I've done a binge writing thing where I wrote a whole novel in like a week. And again, though, it was rewriting a novel. It was me having already written an entire novel, and I had already done all the research and world building, all that stuff. And then just every day for about 5 days, I just rewrote it. And it wasn't the end of it, but it was sort of an experience. It was a binge that was actually pretty effective for me. That could be effective for some other people too. But I think sometimes this happens in fantasy because we hear about, Brandon Sanderson, one of the most successful fantasy authors today, who is literally like the kind of person who writes like 4 to 6 hours a day. But we're not Brandon Sanderson. We don't have this big publishing empire, and that serves his creative process. He talks about this at length in his stuff, but he has a schedule that allows for that sort of thing where he writes all night and he sleeps into the afternoon, but also it's his full-time job, right? And he writes many novels, over the course of just a few years. So all that to be said, you need to find the thing that works for you, because there are other authors who are like, yeah, I write a little bit every day, or maybe I write a little bit every week, whatever it is, but I'm still able to do, all the things that are required for my fantasy novel in the margins. And again, this requires extensive world building, extensive research, looking into things, giving yourself space, giving yourself distance, and giving yourself that emotional bandwidth. Because, yeah, fantasy writing tends to be something that takes a lot out of you creatively. It's such an imaginative thing. I've noticed too, when I'm writing fantasy short stories versus literary short stories, the literary ones take a lot out of me emotionally, but there's so much more about what I don't write, the literary stuff. Whereas the fantasy stuff, it's more of like, yeah, also that, but then more so, how do I translate something super complicated into something simple and interesting? It's just a totally different vibe. And that requires way more homework, I guess. I hate to call it that, but that's how it feels sometimes. You have to rest, though. Resting is part of writing. And so is thinking through problems. As we always say on the show, when you take a shower, you're driving in a car, in a moment where you're not in front of a screen, just thinking through your story, giving yourself space to kind of like chat with yourself, talk to yourself about it. It can reveal a lot of things about your story that have just been kind of stuck, that remain stuck when you're in front of the computer screen trying to do your thing.
It doesn't matter when you write, only that you write consistently. And if you just can't hit your writing goal one week, don't beat yourself up. In fact, sometimes taking a break from your story can be incredibly creatively energizing. It doesn't matter how you get to those final words, the end, just that you do. The next piece of bad writing advice.
So I guess we'll stop it there, because we're already pretty long on time here, and I want folks, of course, to actually watch the video if you want to finish this, and support Alyssa, of course. But yeah, hopefully this was helpful, because I think that overall, bad writing advice really comes down to you, the person, and how you apply the advice that you get. There's not always, you know, there's not like hard and fast rules of like, this is bad advice, this is good advice. A lot of the time, it's just sometimes we are told things and we don't really think through the advice itself, and we don't maybe necessarily question it, right? I always am trying to question when somebody tells me something about my story that they didn't like. I come to it a little bit skeptically of like, well, is it because they're right? Or is it because I didn't properly create a scenario in which, um, that they could experience the story as I intended, however it is, right? She has four more things here. I'm kind of curious what they are. But again, you can watch the video yourself and discern that and maybe take a look at it. But very happy that we were able to do this. I think it was good amount of fun. If you liked it, let me know. If you didn't like it, also let me know. Not like I would be doing something like this all the time, but hopefully for those of you who are in the fantasy space and maybe you want a little bit more stuff like this where I'm responding to things that are not necessarily geared toward fantasy writing or fantasy authors, but maybe I could help kind of bridge that gap. I love to do more of that in the future if that's something that people want. But for now, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you for listening or watching, depending on where you're catching us. The YouTube channel is just John Negroni. And if you like the podcast, it's just look it up, Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. If you have advice or you're looking for advice, if you have a question, prompt you want to share with me, our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. We also have a Discord server where we have some folks, talking about writing every day, which is cool to see. And so you can check that out. It's the In Between Drafts server. Discord server, so you can find there's barbarian writers, there's like a writing channel, all kinds of cool stuff that you can find if you want a little bit of community with your fantasy writing. But for now, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.